All right, greetings. Welcome to all you Constitution fanatics out there to another edition of the Constitution of American Life. As always, the Friends of Publius are pleased to be with you and to share with you a conversation that we would most likely be having whether we were hitting record or not. As usual, we come to you from a variety of different locations. From the city of Bismarck in the great state of North Dakota, home of the state capitol tower, nicknamed the quote, skyscraper on the prairie, we have the always transgressive educator, Professor Chris Kavanaugh.
Is that a compliment?
Yeah, it totally is. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking it up.
It came from a photo I saw of you this week. And from the city of Waukesha, known to the locals simply as the Shah, in the incredible state of Wisconsin, home of Les Paul, the father of the electric guitar, we have our resident Whig, Professor Tim Moore. From the city of Bakersfield in the rebellious state of California, home of some of the best Basque restaurants you will ever find in these United States, we have our truth teller and the man who tells it like it is, Professor David Richmond. And I'm Mike Williams, zooming in from the city of El Cajon, California, the most populous city in East San Diego County, home of Gillespie Field, San Diego's oldest and largest general aviation airport. Now, even though we come from different sections of the country, all of the FOPs have spent quite a bit of time in our nation's capital over the years, where we have many fond memories. In my opinion, Washington, D.C. is without a doubt the best capital city in the world in terms of the history, symbolism, and memorials that you can find there. Specifically, while the monuments each have their own different message, the general theme of them all, I think, is to remind us of our history of fighting tyranny, protecting rights, and establishing justice for all. This is why it's been particularly troubling to watch the current events in Washington, D.C. unfold. As many of you know, our fellow citizens in D.C. do not have the right to vote in congressional elections, and it was only in 1964, through the 23rd Amendment, where they secured the right to vote in presidential elections. In fact, it was not until 1973, just about 8 years after the U.S. officially became a liberal democracy, that D.C. citizens could even elect its own city council and mayor. In a country that has been founded on notions of liberty, equality, and fear of tyrannical government, it is indeed, quote unquote, exceptional that we have allowed this to continue for so long. And I'm hoping that there will be an exhibit at the Smithsonian on this very soon. The upshot of this history of lack of representation is that Washington, D.C. has always been a place where the weight of national government is intensely felt. There have been periods in our history, however, where the national government has utilized its power to enforce a more inclusive form of justice than what we are currently witnessing. For example, did you know that in April of 1862, the District of Columbia Emancipation Act, passed by Congress, freed about 3,100 enslaved people in Washington, D.C. D.C. was actually the first place in the United States where the federal government abolished slavery. Owners were compensated up to $300 per enslaved person, making it a unique way to abolish slavery that would differ from nationwide emancipation later on. To this day, April 16th is commemorated in Washington, D.C. as Emancipation Day. Did you know that after emancipation, Congress and Northern aid societies established schools for freed people in the district? By 1864, the government had begun directly funding schools for African American children in D.C. This was one of the first instances of publicly funded Black education in the United States. In addition, in 1862, Congress passed laws allowing Black residents of D.C. to testify in court cases, something previously denied under slave codes. This was an early legal recognition of African Americans' rights before the nationwide Reconstruction Amendments. It's important to keep in mind that for some of the citizens living in D.C. at the time, these actions were not welcomed, and some thought they were tyrannical. So students, I ask you, what do you think? Are these policies ones that you would consider advancing democracy or inhibiting democracy? What strikes me about this history is that during this period of civil rights reforms and groundbreaking policymaking, it was Congress who was exercising its power, just as dictated by Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of the Constitution. On the other hand, the power that we are witnessing today by the executive branch over DC comes from the somewhat vague powers in Article 2, such as the power to, quote, take care that the laws are implemented. And since DC has no governor, the executive, under its commander-in-chief powers, can order the National Guard to DC. In practice, the Guard cannot be deployed without presidential authorization. As you may remember, this was a big issue during the January 6, 2021 Capitol attack, when the Secretary of Defense ordered it be deployed almost 4 hours after the attacks had begun. The executive's power over DC also comes by way of congressional delegation. The federalizing of DC Police Department that happened in August of this year was invoked because of Section 740 of the Home Rule Act, where the president declared an emergency and transferred control of the Metropolitan Police Department to federal authority. I would argue that based on what the constitutional text says, what we are witnessing in DC so far is legal. But does it make it right? What recourse do our fellow citizens in DC have to exercise their democratic rights and to hold their government accountable? How do we judge whether the national government actions taken before and after the Civil War are any more or less tyrannical than those ones taken today? While I have formulated a set of answers to these questions, what I think is really not the point. I would encourage all of you students to think about how these big, somewhat abstract concepts of tyranny, democracy, and equality are playing out in our nation's capital today, and how past actions and inactions with respect to the promotion of liberal democracy in Washington, D.C. inform what is happening today. And now we are going to do something a bit different with the FOPs, and we're gonna step into pop culture. As you all may have heard, Tim, I'm not sure if you've heard this, so this may be news to you, but there's this pop star, her name is Taylor Swift, and there's this football player by the name of Travis Kelce, who've been dating for a couple years now. They recently, in a very sort of small, not spotlight kind of way, decided to get engaged. And so, as all of you I know love pop culture and have thought a lot about what happens to pop stars when they get married, I'm wondering with each of you, do you think this is happily ever after? Or do you foresee some storms on the horizon for this couple? Uh, Professor Cameron, what do you think?
Oh, geez, I was hoping you're going to Tim first. Um,
I'm quickly looking up who these people are.
I wish these two all the happiness in the world. I am not a Swiftie. I do appreciate football, and they're incredibly. I mean, they're two people at the top of the food chain in their respective careers. If it doesn't work out, I think we're going to get some, for the people that are Taylor Swift fans, we're going to get some incredible music. As I understand it, she's really good at writing about, breakups and people that have done her wrong. On a separate note, this is interesting. I read a piece not long ago about society in Taylor Swift, and it was very interesting. Here's a young woman who's never been married and doesn't have children, but she's in her 30s. But society still tends to think of her as a girl. And some of her contemporaries, and I'll throw out like the Queen Bee, that's Beyonce, Tim, married and with children, society tends to think of her as a woman. And yet Taylor Swift, who is incredibly talented, her Eras tour grossed billions with a B, billions of dollars. Society, because she wasn't married and didn't have children, still thought of her, they see her frozen in time as when she first came on the scene. It was very interesting how a reflection on society writ large, how we may see a female that's successful in her field, independent of, say, a partner or children. So anyway, will it last? I don't know. I hope so. I wish them luck. I do.
Wow, that's a great response, Chris. Professor Richmond, top that.
Oh, there's no way I can because I can't even name one of her songs there. So, I mean, I know who she is, obviously. You'd have to be dead to not know who she is.
Hey.
Or you'd have to be from Western Pennsylvania in the 18th century. One of those two things there. But here's my sense about this is obviously, as you say, a pop culture rich people's expression of love, I guess. And so my sense is that they will divorce before Kansas City wins another Super Bowl. So that's my call.
That is a hot take. Professor Moore.
Uh, I don't know.
And do you care?
No, but that's never prevented me from shooting my mouth off. So I think I mean I wish them all the love of the world too, and but I mean the odds are against them. Being in the pop culture world and all the pressures there of touring and fans and all the egos and that cuts the ego piece cuts on the athlete side too. So I mean, there's enough pressures to really wreak havoc on that marriage. But I mean, and maybe they'll get lucky and beat those odds.
I think the more important question is which one has to sign the prenup.
Mm,
Yeah, yeah,
Pretty sure he
yeah,
does.
yeah.
She might be making more.
well,
Might.
yeah, I think they're going to make it as long as Travis keeps Patrick Mahomes kind of away from his business. I think they're going to be just fine. That's my guess. All right. So with that, going to hand it over to Professor Richmond.
Thank you, Professor Williams. It's time for the American Constitution. Welcome to all of those curious about the theory, history, and design of America's Constitution and how this document functions in an autocratic, authoritarian political culture, if it functions at all. In today's discussion, we will be focusing on political parties, elections, and the roles and responsibilities of voters in America's constitutional republic. Before we kind of get into a contemporary setting, we like to start with our historian. So, Professor Moore, clearly today's elections are popular in that all non-institutionalized citizens 18 or over can participate in an election, whereas in most of our history that was not true. So I have two questions for you. The first one is I'm wondering, as we look at this historically, what influence did both the British and colonial experiences with elections have on the founders, framers, Americans of the late 18th century?
Well, the British tradition voting in England was rooted in this concept of having being a freeholder, owning land. And that carried through into the colonial experience too. Now, it was less problematic in terms of exclusion in the New World because land was so cheap and access to purchase that land was much easier than in the old world, than in England. So the freehold, that concept is still there, but what it looks like varied a bit in terms of the ease of voting or expanding the electorate, frankly. So that was the main influence, and that carries through into the Revolutionary era. They're still talking about, and even at the convention, they're still talking about it. It came up at the convention. Should there be a national freehold policy? And they argued short. The arguments weren't long there at Philadelphia, but they seemed to be pretty intense as to, and Wilson, I think, had an offhanded comment later. We tried, but there's no way we could reconcile all the variations that were going on and the circumstances in all the states. So they abandoned that, but they're still talking, and the states did have this idea of the freehold. You started to see some change in the Revolutionary era from owning property to being a taxpayer. And that was largely because of this rural urban development that cities really grew post-revolution. So they began to think about, well, if we require land ownership, that's going to exclude a lot of people that don't have the acreage amounts in cities. So they started to make the change to tax people that paid taxes. Now they still held on to some freehold ideas. Interestingly enough, military service started to be a thing that developed post-revolution, and we've seen that through our history too. If you fought in a war, voting rights have been extended. So that in the revolution, if you were willing to fight, in a militia, you've served your country, you're willing to fight for heaven's sake. So there ought to be some payoff in terms of political
Even if
influence.
after the fact you went on not to have any property or whatever that was extended to you for lifetime?
Well, I think at that point, in many of the states, the other piece of this, are you paying taxes?
Okay.
Uh, um, Now, eligibility of foreigners was quite flexible. I mean, there's not a lot of records to really hang your hat on any particular argument in that regard. Another interesting thing that developed in the revolutionary time period, late colonial, is what I'm kind of arguing here, is New York kind of led the way on what I would call graduated property requirement. In other words, if you owned 50 acres, you could vote in the assembly. If you had 75 acres, you could vote for the upper house. If you had 100 acres. So you saw, and I don't quote me on those numbers, but there were a couple of states that had that graduated requirement for, what they deemed to be the more hefty, the more important elections. But ultimately, the British influence, I mean, today we call it stakeholders. And the theory is people of means, of property that it can afford to pay taxes, have an independence. They're not beholden financially to anybody, so their vote is truly coming from a place of independence and being a true stakeholder in society. That's the big inheritance from the British, the idea of stakeholder, but it kind of went in some under some revisions in late colonial and revolutionary America.
Okay, so my second question to you is, okay, going from that point through the late 18th and then early 19th to today, other than democratizing, all right, expanding the pie of who can participate, what do you see as the most significant difference
Mm.
as a historian looking back at elections to today?
Um, First of all, violence. There was a ton of
Oh, I was thinking, wow, you got me there. Okay, I thought you were going to say today. It's going. Okay, go on. I'm sorry.
no, I mean compared to today, I mean there was all kinds of election violence in early America. I mean, in the ratification period, there was the Delaware riots. They were selecting their legislature which would have a hand in selecting delegates to the convention. In Sussex County, there was all kinds of violence, a couple deaths. Dobbs County, North Carolina, there was a set of election shenanigans and resulting in violence. So there's in Pennsylvania again, there was an anti-federalist innkeeper who kind of was housing the anti-federalists, and Federalists show up and kind of torch his house. So right on the eve of the election of the delegates to the convention in Pennsylvania. So I think the role of violence is much more pronounced back in the
Yeah.
day. I mean, Americans are used to mobocracy. I mean, Americans, well, British do this, so that's an inheritance, I think.
I,
Um,
well, I'm wondering, does that continues for a while, right? 'Cause like Mike, for some reason, I've gotten obsessed with the 1850s. I know there's clearly plenty of
yeah,
political violence then. I know in
yep.
the late 19th century, in industrial America, there's political violence. When
Well,
did that?
I'm saying specifically election violence.
Right, right. There's
Yeah.
election violence in the 1850s. There is election violence, I know, in New York in the 1870s. I believe it is that I looked it up. But I'm just wondering, when does that, is that a post-World War One? That's not necessarily to you, Tim. Any idea when that kind of fades out? You know, I mean, today
Well,
where
I
we,
think
we,
I think
we
Mike might say we've democratized. I mean, that's kind of the American triumphalist story. We tell this triumphalist story about our expansion of the right to vote, and I think there's something to that. Um, but I think the democratization has lessened the circumstances under which violence would occur. That'd be my response. I don't know, Mike, Chris.
Well, that's what I was kind of like I'm thinking about the violence post-Civil War, that's going to happen when the 15th Amendment is ratified and all the steps. And, and this is one of the reasons why Grant, as president, steps in with what we will call bayonet rule, because of the violence, trying to keep African Americans from the polls. So, and Dave makes a great point about, I think part of that violence in the late 1800s and the early 1900s is somewhat related to also labor, as we're getting ready to come up on Labor Day. So there's a relationship there. I think one of the things Tim said about serving in the military, and I think of in the back of my mind, I'm hearing Jefferson, that if you picked up a musket in defense of your country, something like that, and then that idea is kept alive for obviously the black troops serving in the Civil War prior to the 15th Amendment. That was put out there as well. But I do think your question, David, about when does political violence start to wane? I think that's probably post World War I, to a degree.
I mean, if we're broadening out from electoral violence to political violence, I would say that the lynchings that are happening up through the 1940s and 50s, that's still a form of political violence.
Yeah.
The electoral violence wasn't needed because many Black Americans were not allowed to go to the polls anyways during that period. And what I think is interesting is that after the 1960s, or actually, late 1950s with Eisenhower through the 60s, you still have violence, but it's state, right? It's like, it's supposed to be legitimate coercion. Now the state is coming in to protect rights, and through the 1965 Voting Rights Act to set up a bureaucracy, right, to protect rights. But there's a way to see all that as sort of a violent sort of action, because you are coercing people to do something that they didn't want to do, right?
And Tim, I'm sorry, I took off on this violence thing, but you got to know another thought.
Well, I just had two other thoughts about the differences. The question was differences then and now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's two other things I would note. One is what I would call more structural. The other is more cultural. There was this, back in the day, there was a very open-endedness to election day. Some places, in some places it was 2, 3, 4 days. Some places it was whenever the election official opened it and ended it. I mean, there's all, we talk about LBJ closing the polls in South Texas to get, his winning by 48 votes or something like that. That kind of stuff happened all the time at the founding. There was a very open-ended election policy that occurred, and largely it was at the mercy of the election official in towns. We see that all over the ratification votes that take place for conventions and stuff. The other thing I think is more cultural, and it boils down to two words, I think, at the national level now. At the national level, back in the founding, you stood for election. Now it was kind of seen as just really kind of greasy to run for election and go out and glad hand people and I mean, that's why Madison lost the only election he lost. He didn't ply everybody with liquor, go out and shake hands, which he would have been terrible at. But so standing for election, and you had your lieutenants to go out and do your electioneering for you. You didn't go out and do any of that. So that is a tremendous, I think, cultural difference. And I don't know when we crossed that Rubicon either, where it now became appropriate and acceptable to go out and purposefully seek, and in some people's view, pander for votes. So for standing and running, I think is a big cultural difference between
Andrew Jackson, maybe William Henry Harrison, flying people with hard cider. And students who are watching this, Tim makes a great point, but what that meant was standing. You let your reputation speak for itself. Mm-hmm. You don't grovel for votes. You're not out like glad handing and stuff, right? And you do have some lieutenants that are working, but as opposed to the modern concept of running for office. So maybe William Henry Harrison and his great, 1 month in office.
It's a good guess. It's a good guess. Yeah.
So Professor Kavanaugh, I know this is a basic question, but there's still a lot of, I think, fuzziness in this topic. And in fact, I looked at numerous sources, and they all seem to say the same thing, and that is whether or not the founders, framers intended to have political parties, and they all say no. Yeah, I've heard on this program, that's a little bit, I guess it's squishier than that. And it depends on what you mean by political parties, I guess. So if you can help provide some clarity about the vision that the framers have, and did that include formal parties as we understand them?
Well, we all know that in students you'll find out that nowhere in the Constitution are political parties mentioned. I would direct you, and Jefferson about belonging to parties, and which is a little rich for Jefferson, honestly, to say that poo-pooing political parties, even Washington to a degree, right? So, did they intend? I don't know if they intended. I'm going to steal a line that one of my students used today, David, which I love this. What this young lady said in class. We're talking about history. She said, "Well, the history is blurry." Right? And I think we use the word squishy. I think we stole that from Tim. But I like the idea that history is blurry. Did they intend political parties? No, they didn't. They weren't intentional about it. But did they know they were going to happen? Of course, they knew they were going to happen. They already existed, right? People already had, and I'm gonna use Madison's term. They already had factions. My goodness, they already had factions. I mean, see Patrick Henry as governor of Virginia. So they had their, I don't know what we want to call it. They might not call them parties, but they kind of alluded to parties. So did they intend them to happen? Did they know they were going to happen? Yeah, because that's human nature. And Madison describes that in Fed 10 when he's talking about factions. And the only way you control those, obviously, is for students when you get into Fed 10, you'll read this, is to have a multiplicity of them. So no one dominates.
Are there former parties over in England at this time? 1770s, 1780s.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So they've seen this formal kind of structure there, and that leads, and the fact that you said that you don't need to intend for something that already exists. One might argue, but the fact that they didn't mention them to me brings up another question, that they play, all right, a very powerful role in both our political and constitutional system. So given that they play this huge role, but they aren't mentioned, all right, seems to me to undermine the idea that we have a limited government, because there's nothing that the people that legally you can really do to restrict party influence, party power in our constitutional structure. Am I right there, or am I way off base?
I push back a little bit on that in the fact that I think that we do, because to borrow Madison, obviously we don't have multiple factions, but you could, this is the age-old question: are political parties factions, or are there factions within political parties? Now, I think we used to think of there being factions within political parties, and we may get into this a little bit later about these different groups within political parties being able to have sway over their party. But I do think that now, even though it's not written, we maybe rely on the party out of power to hold the party in power in check. So, and therefore providing some type of limited government.
Yeah, that's the political process, and I understand that. But I mean, it seems to me that we have covered parties with such layers of protection as entities themselves, through the First Amendment and the right to association and the right to speech, through calling money speech and allowing them to spend as much money as God knows to manipulate the political process. So,
yeah, in a modern sense, for sure. But you think about the 4 of the 5 liberties in the First Amendment are really considered political rights: speech, press, petition, and assembly. That allowed you to participate in the political process. So, and when you allow people the liberty to participate in that political process, human nature says you're going to find people that think like you, and they want the same policy outcomes as you. So you're going to work together to achieve those using those. Now, what's happened over time, as you alluded to, money, that has become more expensive. I mean, it's expensive to run for any office. It's expensive to run for school board, right?
Right. Yeah, but my trouble is that here's the people, the majority of the people consistently have said they want to control the influence of money. And so we pass laws. But according to the court, the Constitution doesn't allow the people or the opposition to do anything about that. And that's, I guess, my trouble here with the
Well, of
system.
course,
Tim,
and
you were going to jump in.
well, I'm sorry. Let me.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
Let
go
Chris.
ahead, Chris.
you're right, but sometimes I think politicians they poo-poo the fact that they've got to be on the phone begging for money from people, right? About what 4 hours a day is I think the last number I
Something
saw.
like that, yeah.
You're not spending 4 hours a day on the phone, or not necessarily on the phone, but reaching out to donors and people that can donate a minimum of $1,000. So you're behind, and then you've got to take some of that money. It's kind of like Amway. You got to take some of that money and put it into the party, so the party then can distribute those goodies, for sure. And then politicians say, well, I wish I didn't have to do this. Well, you don't have to do that if you get everybody in Congress to agree we're going to change the rules. But they can't get people in Congress to agree to change the rules.
Tim?
Yeah, on the question of the founders and political parties, first of all, I have two thoughts about that. There's two great books that make the argument that refute everything that you're reading, David. Jack Rakoff, one of his very first books was, I think, titled something like Political Parties in the Continental Congress. And he makes the argument that we had political parties. And a Jensen student named Jackson Turner Maine wrote a book called Political Parties Before the Constitution. And there are other historians too that kind of to run counter to this argument that the founders weren't aware of and they were shocked by these political parties, blah blah blah. So I would recommend, especially Turner Maine's. He was a Jensen student actually. I had the privilege of meeting him once. So there is a tremendous argument to be made that these political parties existed. Now my second point is political parties back then. I mean, they weren't going to call them that. Matt, is Madison talking about parties when he talks about faction? Yeah, and that's a great question for students to wrestle with. But it's my view that the size of the country would automatically, let's take Madison's faction argument. The size of the country would automatically increase the number of these factions/parties, right? So that's tremendously different than a smaller place called England. So the size of the country itself will create a lot more parties/factions. Also, Madison seems to assume that there'll be some fluidity, that they won't be stiff and rigid the way we have them now. So it's kind of an apples to oranges question about what was the nature of political parties back then. I say they existed, but there also was an assumption there'll be a lot more because of this factional argument, which is a result of the size of the country and the ever-changing. And this is Rakoff's argument, as well as a book by Hendricks on the Continental Congress. These factions are constantly shifting throughout the American Revolution. You see these, Massachusetts is in line with Pennsylvania on some things, and then so they're very fluid. Now, that may not mean they fit the modern definition of party, but that's the nature of what they were then.
Mike?
Yeah, I just haven't read those books, Tim, so I'm going to pick those up. But it seems to me that this fluidity argument, I mean, the two main parties in England in the 1780s, of which the founders would have a model, there wasn't a lot of models of this. So you have England, you have the Tories and the Whigs. That my understanding is those two parties are really defined around what do you think about royal prerogative. So it's like they're like one issue parties, right? So they're, if you're Madison, to kind of make a counter argument here against books I haven't read, I guess it seems to me, in addition to all the fluidity, you're setting up a system of which no one's going to be rotating about whether they're in favor of the king or not. So that one issue is gone. Then you have the fluidity, and then I think on this, David, and you've made this argument a lot, Dave, about maybe Madison overestimated civic virtue. And I think he thought that the political class were going to have certain values and a sentimentality where, yeah, we could disagree, but everyone's persuadable. Like, we're going to make arguments and we're going to persuade. and that you would never have a person who was fixed to a platform of which then they would just not vote against. And I think Madison just misunderstood what was happening under the ground of which he was standing, right? Because that had happened with the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. So I think there's also just a misunderstanding by Madison of human nature.
Yeah, ditto. I was going to say human nature, ditto. Or for students, was Madison just like blowing smoke in Fed 10? Right? Because is he challenging Montesquieu that you can't have a republic over such a large period? And it's like, over a large entity, like Tim was alluding to. And is he thinking, oh, how can I take Montesquieu and turn him upside down here? Oh yeah,
I see that as a different question, Chris, than is he talking about parties or not? I mean, I agree with you on him reconfiguring Montesquieu, but I think the political party question is a bit different.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, I mean, read Turner, Maine, and then we get together in D.C. Under a monument, I guess, and we'll talk about whether Jackson Turner Maine's is onto something.
Well, Mike, I'm glad you recognize, and I've always felt like I'm the lone angel here who believes that the framers made numerous errors in design, and the motive is that they had an inflated view of virtue. So my question to you is, wasn't one of these big mistakes, it seems to me, is that they allowed politicians to draw their own legislative districts. And I see that as one of the major structural errors, not just today, but throughout our entire history. But it's especially made, come to light with what we see in Texas and in California and possibly elsewhere going on in the country today. Do you agree with me on that? That looking back and trying to be fair to these guys, but that was some kind of, just really major error. All right. And an assumption in the virtue of the people by the framers.
I'm coming around to your argument, Dave, on the design flaws. I mean, especially around Article 2. I think I'm there with that. That article we were exchanging around. I think that's by French. I think it was is a good one with that. With this question, though, I'm not all the way there, and this is why. I don't think that allowing the state legislatures to draw the districts at this time had much to do with anything but state sovereignty, and that was the way they saw the world. This was something states did. To Tim's point that he just made, it came up to have some sort of national uniform freehold, and it got dismissed right away. When it came to like political power, at least the Southern delegations were not going to go for anything where the national government had the ability to do this. And it was 150 years of every colony forming its own way of apportioning and counting up votes. I don't think there was much choice with that. But given that, Congress does have the power. While the Constitution says it's left to the state legislatures, there's an important clause there. Congress can step in and do stuff. And this is what the students should be thinking about, that the power is there. Now, at the time of the first elections in our nation's capital, a lot of states just had single-member districts, which meant there was nothing to draw. Like all of New Jersey was one district, right? And the person who got the most votes won. Then other states started doing other things with single-member districts. Well, Congress acted in 1842. They actually passed an apportionment bill. I apparently have been teaching this wrong for about 20 years because I've always been telling my students, if California wanted to adopt proportional representation, they could. According to the 1852 law, they cannot. It is mandated to have single-member districts that are contiguous, right? That's in 1842. They continued to pass these things. 1965, they passed laws that have to do with elections. There's a law before Congress right now, right, 2 years ago that got passed the House when the Democrats were in control. So it's not there anymore. It was a previous session that would mandate independent electoral commissions for every single state. Congress has the power to do this. but Congress doesn't have the will to act, or maybe doesn't have the majority to act. So in terms of the gerrymandering that we're seeing, that's been around, since just about the founding, since 1812. I don't think that is a design error. I think they gave us a way out if Congress acts. Congress has acted. But I think that right now we're just not in a political environment where Congress is going to step into it.
Chris or Tim? Tim?
Kesar has a great book on the right to vote, the contested history of democracy in America. It's a great book on the history of voting. And he makes the argument, that there was an ideological reason for this trade-off, like we will let states be in charge of federal elections at a local level. He makes the argument that there's an ideological reason, federalism, so it winds up being a bargain, as so many bargains are in the Constitution between national and local. But he also said there was a practicality to that decision. What kind of manpower and money would the national government have to put election officials in all those districts around in all the states around the country? So he's willing to say there was some ideological reason behind this bargain, but the practicality also it plays into this.
Well, what about the idea? I mean, we've got the modern idea of the independent commission. I mean, you don't have to sacrifice sovereignty if you create another entity to do that job. And it's not unheard of in the 18th century in England to have entities, branches off of Parliament to do some work and make some suggestions to the full Parliament there. So that's probably where I'm going. So I don't want to sacrifice state sovereignty. I understand that argument, but there was other ways to me to do it versus just putting it in the hands of elected officials at the state level. I guess that's my.
They got a constitution that could get passed and ratified. Now we can fault them for, if that's a design flaw, okay, but they're also the convention always has, can this get ratified? A very practical question.
Well, I think Mike said it, though, it's the political will, because in Article 1, Section 4, Congress has the authority. They had the authority in 1789, but they're sure as heck not going to touch it. Because, I mean, being so new, I mean, the cement is still drying on that thing. And so if they step in and start saying, oh, by the way, we're going to exercise some power. And plus, you have to understand the provincial nature of Congress at the time. These guys are still beholden to their districts. Senators were still elected by state legislatures. So, I mean, they're not going to, even though they have the power, they're not going to touch that. That's like the third rail at that point. And Tim mentioned the Kesar book. He talks about the practical nature. They've already got a system in place. Don't mess with it, because we're not going to mess with it.
And the students should know that this is another area where we are exceptional. There is no other modern democracy in the world that allows the politicians to drop the districts like we do. From Canada to UK to South Africa, it's all some form of independent electoral commissions. Now, some of them, like in Germany, the final decisions of those commissions have to be voted on by the lower house, right? So there's some sort of political check there. But between giving it to the state legislatures and the RUCO decision that basically says the Supreme Court has said we are not going to get involved if it's partisan gerrymandering, it just means that the gloves are off, and then you add in the technology of what they can use now to draw these things up. It's one of these areas of reform that makes me think about 100 years ago with the progressives. If anything can come out of this period we're living in, can we at least get some of these kind of basic reforms to make it so that the political game is structured in a way that is fair and not as corrupt as it is today.
Students,
and the two great founding period gerrymanders are the Henry Mander of so students look up the Madison's election where he gets gerrymandered before gerrymander was a word in Virginia, and then obviously the gerrymander up in Massachusetts, Elbridge Gerry. So those are the two founding period great gerrymanders.
And students, you'll run across this in your research, probably the idea that the voters used to pick the representatives. Now representatives are picking their voters.
Yeah.
So, Professor Moore, you've already kind of touched on it a little bit, and that is we are a federal system of government. So we not only separate power at the national level, we divide it between state and national government. there. So I'm wondering, this federal system of elections that we have, national, state, and local elections, what impact has that had on the role and responsibility of voters in our constitutional democracy?
Uh, a heck of a lot. I
Well, yeah.
I looked this up. I had a chuckle out loud moment here. I think it was yesterday I ran across this. We have, by all good estimates, over 10,000 elections each year in this country. Now, the fact that nobody knows exactly how many we actually have is quite telling, let's put it that way. So that's a tremendous burden for me to keep track of who's running for dog catcher. I think Chris, was it last year one of these episodes said that there's somebody someplace in New York where the dog catcher has to run? School boards, the zoning boards, the city council, mayors, there's regional entities all over this country. So 10,000 elections every year. That's a tremendous burden on the citizen. And we piss and moan about like voter turnouts going down, down, down. Well, and there's a lot of reasons I think for that. But the fact that we are we expecting too much even for engaged citizens to keep track of? I say yes.
Yeah.
So
I
then
think
that begs the
ballot.
question, well, what's the solution? Do we reduce the number of elections? Do we do we do we wind up appointments rather than elections? I mean, there's all kinds. It's a nightmare with that many in our federal system, the number of elections that we have.
So you would agree that that notion of ballot fatigue, all right, is a contributing factor of why the United States, at least in the last
Well,
couple of
yeah,
years.
I think ballot fatigue is any particular given election, but I'm making the argument we have election fatigue.
Well, electoral fatigue and yeah,
Yeah,
both of
yeah,
them combined. But
sure, sure.
it's a key factor in why Americans tend to vote at lower rates than a lot of other mature
Yeah,
democracies.
off years, right, right.
Yeah, yeah, we
Well,
got off years, we got all that. Go
Well,
ahead,
we got
Chris.
what? Presidential, off years, special elections. I think those are the three major categories of types of elections we have.
well,
But it's
and
it's a
part of the issue
tremendous.
too is, I mean, one in states like California where you have initiative and referendums, now you're doing some direct democracy, and I've read some of those, and I like to think that I'm fairly literate, and I still struggle trying to make sense of them.
Yeah.
And two, it be just be it. I think of de Tocqueville, and he talks about, when he's looking at America, it's like a kid at Christmas. When you're a kid at Christmas, you got that new toy, you play with it a lot, right? You play with it a lot because it's new, it's shiny, it's sweet. You unwrapped it, and by after a while, it's just sitting over in the corner because you're tired of it. You're done with it, and I think the whole idea we see this now because he Tocqueville compares us to what he saw in Europe, and the apathy that he saw in Europe, but he saw here, a nation of joiners, and people are joining political organizations and all kinds of things, and now the sheen has worn off a little bit, and so we get to that point of ballot fatigue or election fatigue, and trying to understand referendums or initiatives, and it's like I'm gonna go watch the game, or I've got Dancing with the Stars on or something, and somebody else would take care of it.
Well, and that leads me, Tim, to be an advocate. I'm wondering, because given the mobility, all right, of Americans, all right, we are a very mobile people, at least we have been, in the last 75, 80 years or so, I feel sorry for those that have to move jurisdiction state to state to understand the rules. So would you agree with me that we'd be better served with a unitary electoral system?
Oh no, no.
Ooh.
I'd rather know who the corrupt politicians are at a local level than have some faceless bureaucrat at the national level doing all these shenanigans. I mean, I'm not willing to replace local control of elections where the possibility of reform is more immediate and more probable than a national system. Um, so yeah, I'm not convinced the unitary view would be. Now, by the way, I think your mobility argument, in some ways, I think strengthens the argument of those who would say there should be a residency requirement. which is interesting. Back at the founding, they were quite varied on that. Some just said you had to swear that you were going to hang around, that you were a member of a community. Well, you know, wow, talk about an assumption of virtue. So but to your question directly, I would have I would take the view that a unitary system would replace another set of problems that may be more difficult to solve than the ones we have.
I'm having a hard time because I'm advocating for uniform rules of access to ballot, what the ballot looks like. Now, I'm not talking about the national government intruding on issues or anything like that or on
Oh,
candidates.
okay.
I'm
Yeah,
talking about that a ballot should look the same regardless of where you are in this country. Obviously, you'll have to account, all right, for some differing things
yeah,
by states, but the ballot should look
yeah,
like the same ballot. The rules of when polls are open and all that kind of stuff, that should be the same. How to register to vote, that should
yeah.
all be the same there. So
Well, I could go there. I could go there, but I guess I was thinking more at an administrative level. So I'll
yeah,
concede that. Yeah.
yeah. Chris or Mike, any thoughts about
Well,
that?
I mean, for the students, historically, though, go back and look at some of the anti-federalists writing, definitely opposed to any of that. I mean, that was a big sticking point. Tim can clean that up, but I think that there were some anti-federalists that were like, when they saw that Congress has the authority in these elections in Article 1, Section 4, even though we're going to let the local folks do it, man, there were some anti-federalists that would say, no
Well,
way.
isn't that outright paranoia? I don't understand why national rules, all right, of how elections are run. I don't know how that intrudes on sovereignty.
Well, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I don't know. I'm just stating what the anti-federalists were like. They again, this worrisome. And back to what I said earlier, why even though Congress had the authority early on, they're not going to touch that. But yeah, today in a modern sense, well, because I mean, think how we've struggled to expand the table for voting rights. I mean, why do we struggle for getting African Americans voting rights? Why do we
Yeah.
struggle getting women voting rights? Why do we struggle getting anybody voting rights? Because it becomes about control, and people are reluctant to give up control.
Mike, any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I guess I'm turning into an anti-federalist all of a sudden.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
at least
You're
on this.
not a wig.
I
You're not
mean,
a wig.
I mean,
Yeah. A wig, that's too far. A wig, that's way too far.
I was with Tim until he changed his mind. I'm just imagining now, um, like the whole system has to be working the way it wants, the way you expect it to then to have one person in charge of elections. And David, even your thing, okay, so we're going to have this one time, this one ballot. Well, once you put that on paper, there's going to be room for interpretation. And if it's one person you have to persuade to to make a finding that would influence the election results, that worries me more than, okay, you have to go county by county and persuade someone there. So I guess I don't have the same sort of trust level I have had, or maybe I have some lived experience now of what it looks like to have some leaders in power who are not afraid to use their leverage over the one person that matters, right? It takes one person to convince about vaccines, and vaccine policy changes, right? So I don't know. I'm a little hesitant to the idea of one person that could be manipulated.
Yeah, we
Right.
went through that here in the last election here in Wisconsin with the whole fake electors. There was only two people, and they've been charged here in the state that had to be convinced of election tinkering. So, yeah.
Wow.
So, Professor Kavanaugh, one of the most significant changes made in our political system over the last 100 years was the creation of the primary system. I just read a fascinating article that advocated eliminating Democratic primaries and turning the decision making back to party leadership, them choosing candidates. We used to talk about the smoke-filled room kind of element because it's impossible in today's environment for the average American to stay up on issues and to trust the information that's out there that they receive through the media. What are your thoughts about that? Let's get rid of the primaries because primary elections are, to me, again, one of the roots to the evil of which we live in today, because, well, you know why. What do you think about getting rid of the
Well,
primary?
I'm all for it as long as I get to choose the candidates. I'm good. If I'm that one guy Mike's talking about, I'm happy with it. No, I think I'm joking, obviously. I think there are arguments for that. The idea of like you have a greater vetting of candidates if you allow that, right? You have maybe some reduced polarization, maybe some mitigation of misinformation, right? But I would also argue that I know real world examples of primaries where people upset long entrenched members of the party. And I don't want to tell personal stories, but I'm very well aware of folks that have gone and banged on doors in places and unseated a member from their own party that had been in power at the state level for decades. And so there is, in a primary system, if you're willing to do the work, you still have the ability to get different voices heard. So there's the other side to that. So I think for the students, I'll put something in the show notes about what they call the McGovern. I think they're called the McGovern reforms. Is that right, Mike? You're the poli sci guy that comes out after the election of '68, and what happens after Johnson drops out, and then McGovern gets in, and the whole shenanigans of creating delegates. This is for presidential elections. Sorry, the Democratic Party creating super delegates that have more juice than the average delegate. So students, I would encourage you to look up the McGovern reforms that the Democratic Party went to in the early 70s following the 68 election, which eventually I think the Republicans will adopt too. So, but there are advantages to having the political elite back to the smoke-filled rooms, right? But there are also disadvantages, I think.
Well, you know dang well, if we had that traditional system, all right, before the primaries really took over, and it's not really until the 60s, is it? I mean, I know it's in the progressive period that you start to see the notion of democratic populist choice of nominees for the parties, but that really doesn't become grounded until the 1960s, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kesar talks about that in his book.
All right, so that's what I mean. If we go back, to the 1940s, all right, my one piece of argument, Chris, is there's no Donald Trump. If the Republican leadership, the good old boys of the Republican Party in 2015 are choosing, or 2016 are choosing the nominee for the Republican Party, there is no Donald Trump, and we don't live in an authoritarian.
Well, you may not have Obama either. I mean,
Obama, yeah.
yeah.
I'm willing to make the trade-off.
Well, the other thing is, and I'm not sure where this fits, but I always think of, I think it was Mark Hanna, who was a big time, one of the bosses that was always in the background, one of the political bosses for the Republicans at the turn of the last century. And when here's you got this really populist governor of New York called Teddy Roosevelt, who's making all kinds of reforms and incredibly popular, right? Thanks to obviously his persona. And it's like, where can we stash this guy, right? Where can we put this guy that we can just kind of dead end him? Oh, I know. We're going to nominate him for the vice presidency. And Hannah is like losing his mind. And I'm not going to use some of the language he reportedly has used, but you guys put this insane, you put this madman, he's referring to TRs, or you put this madman, but that's not exactly what he calls him, one bullet away from the presidency. Oops. Yeah. And then TR gets on. So there is the ability to get different people even in with that.
I think it's important to for the students to think about what's the actual problem we need to solve with this, because I don't disagree that maybe the primaries as they're actually working right now is not the best thing, but it's hard for me, this is like a free speech argument. It's hard for me to argue against okay, we need free speech. It's hard for me to argue against that less participation is better, but at the same time, going back to having the parties do it is not going to solve it. I think two of the issues with the primaries right now is that they probably last too long. They're too staggered, especially with the presidential ones, and there's too much money. I think some of this, if I mean, now that we're in the part of the show, it's like, make a wish of what you want to fix with the system. Like if you had the primary system without the influence of money, right, then maybe you get some outcomes that we're all going to feel better with. But I do think that, I mean, Ezra Klein made this argument from the beginning about with Biden and Harris, right? He argued a primary, if Biden wasn't going to run, there needed to be some sort of primary because you needed to see how candidates are resonating with the people. This is a democracy. I think there's something to be said for someone to be out there in a primary and seeing, does this message resonate? I mean, that's what's happened with Mamdani in New York. He was able to get his voice out there, and all of a sudden, so I think there's something to be said for that. I just think it's so corrupted with the money and with this exhaustion of people like feeling like another election, does my vote really matter? That maybe we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater with this.
Well, if we're in the Make-A-Wish segment, then let's go back to our boy little Jimmy and let's go what he really wanted, because then you're going to end up with more of a parliamentary system,
Right.
which would allow for a multiplicity of those factions he was talking about, right? So I think that's the thing. And also a point I wanted to make earlier is like, if you're a person that your twig has been in one direction, but you live in a state where, since we have the winner take all system, you live in a state, no matter, that your vote is not going to matter, so you don't show up. It limits the democracy. It is true for people that vote Republican living in a blue state, or people that vote Democratic that live in a red state. So there are all kinds of things we could do, but again, back to the political will, and no one wants to kill that goose that's laying that golden egg for them.
Oh, I'm willing to do that. And I
Well,
wanted to
you
make
are, but the elected officials have to. But I think Mike's point about Mamdani is excellent. That, this is a person that has, and again, knocking on doors. You're knocking on doors. You're knocking on doors, and that's really, really important.
Well, again, especially when we get to congressional and presidential elections, I first would ask, what is the voter turnout in primaries? We're not talking, we're talking maybe 10% of the electorate is participating. So it's not really that democratic. It's not really that much more participatory. And secondly, I would go to history. Two of the most, I think, significant changes in American history came under the older system, and that was the progressive period, and that was the election by the good old boys of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. All right, so we get and again, you might even go back to Reconstruction under that good old, and within Congress, and who are the representatives? Because the leaders of the state party are going to represent where that party is at the time, which is why the National Party has a hard time controlling, the various state parties and stuff. And so it's something to consider there that we have our two most significant legislative eras in history without primary elections.
Well, I don't disagree with that, David. I'm going to push back a little bit though about that voter turnout, because we know that if you're got an R behind your name in districts, you're good. Doesn't matter who you are. If you got that R behind your name, you're good. And the same thing is true if you got that D behind your name. And depending on the districts, the way the districts are drawn, right, and the way the system works now, people won't show up for primaries because it really doesn't matter, because you're in a safe district. So if we would change the system to maybe more ranked choice,
sure. All those Make-A-Wish things, but the problem with the primary system, as if you and Mike have both identified, the current problems with it is that because of these safe districts, which are what, 90% of the congressional districts, and maybe I'm
recidivism, that's for sure.
Right. Okay. That it pushes the decisions out to the extremes. And my sense is that party leadership, all right, is a better barrier to that than the populace lets the extreme members of each party be choosing it. That's something for kids to consider.
And this is true. I mean, to solidify your argument, what is the fear now that people have about standing up to the current president, that they'll get primaried?
Exactly.
Not that they'll lose the general. They'll get primaried by somebody else with deeper pockets and maybe more national support.
Yeah. All right. So, Professor Williams, here I am again. put myself, I, along with some other, and I'm going to call myself a purist, I don't believe that making voting easier and increasing voter participation has made American democracy stronger and more efficient. And I'm wondering, as a political scientist, what are your thoughts about increasing voter participation through any means necessary?
Well,
Thank
as
you.
a political scientist, I would say, how are you defining stronger and efficient? And why are those goals that we're going after? Um, so I know what you're getting at, though. I
Thank
think
you.
I think that I think there's mixed evidence on that. So I think we could argue through the late 60s and 70s when we were first a liberal democracy, I think there were a lot of laws being passed, and I think we would argue that a lot of laws that have stood the test of time in terms of the environment, in terms of other things like that. Um, I don't think, again, I don't think the problem, the issue is more participation, right? I think participation is the input. Voters go and they say, this is what we want. But then that input goes into this black box. And this black box is a place where the House runs every 2 years, right? Where there are off-year elections. We've already talked about it. Political science literature, we know that in these off-year elections, turnout goes down, interest goes down. We know that in the Senate, now with the way that the filibuster is used, that things can't get done. So there are things that are frustrating the will of the people that have nothing to do with the fact that they are participating or not. And to think about if we were to make voting, I guess, less easy, right? I think that runs into a problem where the perception of legitimacy of the system, I think, goes down if you limit the participation. And there's evidence that the actual whether you are a liberal democracy or not is correlated with how much participation there is. There's this organization called Freedom House that I use a lot in my classes that ranks countries, right? The United States' latest score is an 84. So we are still a free country, but we're just right there. We're kind of in the A minus range, I guess, or I guess if you're going down to yeah.
A-minus, there's some
An
serious
85.
grade,
Okay,
serious grade inflation.
I knew you guys were gonna
Great
attack.
inflation.
If all A's are free countries, that's what I'm trying to say. We're barely in there. A country like Norway and Sweden, they're at 100, right? And there's a correlation between when you look at voting age population, the percentage of those who are voting. So there's two ways to measure voting, those of registered voters and those of voting age population. Most political scientists think voting age population is a better number to use because that's a number that doesn't get into how easy it is to register in the different countries. The United States is near the bottom in terms of the percentage of people of the voting age population who vote. And those who are at the top of that are also the countries that Freedom House says are the most democratic. So I do think that there is a correlation there. I think that what is going on in our system is not an issue of voter participation. It's an issue of how our system has been designed or the way it is currently working under those who are using it that are frustrating the will of the majority on so many issues. And we've talked about this on other episodes, right? There are clear majorities out there for again, students, this is not like the Democratic platform, the Republican platform. I'm just saying voters who say we should have some sort of gun control, there's a clear majority. Voters who say that we should have some sort of regulations of climate change, there's a clear majority. Voters who say there should be some right choice to abortion, there's a clear majority. And that gets frustrated by the Senate. It's also getting frustrated, and this is the final thing I'll say, to David's point, at best right now there are 40 seats that are competitive, at best. And after this next round of redistricting in Texas and California, if it passes and here in California, we're probably down to maybe 20 seats out of 435 that are actually competitive. And we know from our research on voting what gets a lot of people to the polls and excited. Well, when there's a competitive election. So all this, I think, are factors that go into play that could make the democracy stronger and more efficient. I don't think we should be sacrificing participation for that.
Yeah, Chris.
I think one thing, it's interesting, you guys were using the term off year election, right? But commonly referred to as midterm. And think about the terminology we're using. Midterm in terms of halfway through the presidency, which tells you where our focus has gone over the years, is to the election of one office. And of course, that is the one office that, registered voters and people that show up and vote have a control over. That's the only office we all share. So we got 4 people here, all live in 4 different places. That's the only office we share. We call it a midterm, right? And we know that the midterms traditionally are, poor turnout. But my question, and I have a question actually for you guys. What do you think? What do you think turnout's going to be this midterm? Because I see from what I've seen and following, a lot of people are getting really frustrated with things. Even people in traditionally, certain districts are already getting turned out. I'm thinking that there's going to be some serious numbers turning out in 2026. That's my prediction. Serious numbers.
I disagree with you.
Okay.
I think most Americans are, and partly to what you referenced before, we talked about federal system of most Americans are so burned out at this point because they thought in 2008 that, as you guys, they thought the Obama election was going to be historic in the long term, and then it was going to transform America because of Obama's personality and his moderate kind of approach. We're all, kind of a remake of the Jeffersonian statement. There are no, democratic America, that kind of thing. And then they also thought there was going to be massive change with Trump and the positive. And I think most Americans are seeing that the political system can't really solve the problems. And here in California, the only thing that really changes you see, and this is true, I think, in every state, you see higher rates of voting in presidential. In the midterm, the only thing that matters is what's on the initiatives. What initiatives are being proposed, and are there really emotional ones that are going to bring out voters? That's when we see higher rates, if there's some initiative that really resonates with the people. And I don't know right now if that's going to happen, but my sense in California, especially if we allow for the districts to be gerrymandered, that participation will actually decrease, because when you have safe districts. I live in a Republican, one of the few very safe Republican districts, and we have one of the lowest voter turnout rates of any congressional district in California. Why? Because everybody knows who's going to win.
That's my point from earlier. That's what drives down turnout, is that doesn't matter, who it is, as long as you have the RD after your name.
Right. We agree on that. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for putting up with my narcissism and wacky views of the Constitution. It's now time for you to provide your final thoughts and recommendations to students and teachers dealing with Unit 6, Question 3 on elections and voters and voter behavior there. So, Professor Williams.
Yeah, I'm gonna riff off something Tim was talking about, or the question about electoral violence or elections and violence. I believe it was Clausewitz who said that war is simply the continuation of politics by other means. And I guess what struck me as I was listening to that is students for you to think about this very thin line between violence and the institutions we have set up are meant to resolve disputes without violence. That's why we have politics. But it just strikes me, right? The language that we use to talk about politics, and this is how I was thinking about it. We're talking about campaigns, right? Tim mentioned a lieutenant in one of the campaign managers. We talk about war rooms and battleground states and attack ags and ground game. I mean, this language that we use to even talk about elections has all this sort of like military imagery to it, and I don't know, from a comparative perspective, I don't have the answer to this. I'm going to do some research, because I think I don't know if this is an American phenomenon or not, but I just think it's a reminder to us culturally, this line between solving disputes by violence or solving them through participation and peaceful means of voting is so thin in our history. And according to Tim, we have this long history of using violence. So I don't know. I think that's important to keep in mind in the days we're in now, about how much of this is maybe in our cultural soil that we haven't recognized in maybe a while.
Professor Kavanaugh.
Yeah, that's really good, Mike. And I'm still thinking about you guys talking earlier about the differences between electoral violence and political violence. And I do think there's a difference there clearly. So students think about that. Listening to us, and I know that we can continue on with this. We're obviously bringing in some current events here. And, you know, in the We the People curriculum, and this is true not for just this question, but maybe especially this question, where we are right now, you know, we kind of approach this from a viewpoint of, you know, if we were in the West Wing perfect world, this is how we would do things, right? So we're dealing all this political theory and these history, you know, bringing in history and stuff. But when you're on a competition and you've got states that are that are currently right now in a, to use Mike's idea, in a battle about controlling districts. When you have a president that's making noises about getting rid of voting machines and mail-in ballots. So yeah, the book is great, right? And the ideas and the questions are great, but don't forget to deal with the reality on the ground right now, because many of you guys are going to be voters. You're going to be voters in that midterm election or the off-year election we talked about. So when you're dealing with this stuff, deal with the reality on the ground as it stands right now, as Mike alluded to in the opening of our program about Washington, D.C., which I thought was incredibly poignant. So don't be afraid to deal with the reality as you see it. And that's okay, because you're entitled to that opinion. Think about how to back up what you feel about what's going on right now.
Professor Moore.
I've been listening, and I was struck by a single word that Mike used in one of his responses, the idea of legitimacy. I mean, if we anytime we restrict the vote, regardless of turnout, if we restrict vote, it runs counter to the whole Lockean principle of consent. And I know there's an argument to be made that consent is different than voting. But Mike's point about legitimacy, can we with a straight face say we have legitimate a democratic republic if we restrict? And I guess I'm willing to live with the non-voter problem, because in some ways it strikes me as Locke's tacit consent argument. I mean, to bring it back to philosophy. So maybe the non-voter is tacit consent, our modern version of Locke's tacit consent. But restrictions really, I think, runs afoul of legitimacy and the consent that we claim is fundamental to our system.
Very good, gentlemen. Just a brief thing. Students, although it sounds wacky, counterintuitive, or counter-American values on the notion of primaries, just be prepared to present both sides on all of these issues, because there is another side here that some of these changes that we've made in the last 100 years, although good on paper, which is true of the framers, a lot of things were probably good on paper, but then they got put into practice, and we see how the Electoral College has worked out there, kind of thing. So just be prepared to make opposing views to what is the norm of the American political process today. And lastly, remember what this program is about, and we look at voter behavior. All right, civic education involves a three-legged stool. Good civic education builds good or strong civic knowledge, strong civic skills, and strong civic aptitudes. I would say that we are getting about a D or D minus on all three these days there. And that's what makes me very, very, skeptical, cynical, however you want to define it, about expanding this, expanding it to people who don't have knowledge, skills, or aptitudes. Always, to me, is putting the political power in the hands of a very dangerous group. But that's just one person's opinion. There is an opposing view there. But think about the purpose of civic education. So the next time that we meet, we're going to be talking about Youngstown Sheet and what is that, Tube Company versus Sawyer. Again, I find that interesting because I think in our previous episode we had kind of referred to that. that, and presidential power. Now, talk about a very timely subject for us to go down with next time we see you. It is that issue of executive power. So until then, peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye-bye. Bye bonds.